The warning lights flashed red across the bridge of the New Horizon as Captain Jake Morrison watched his ship die around him. The main engine had failed 3 hours ago, and now the backup systems were shutting down one by one. His crew of 847 people floated in the cold darkness, between stars with no way home and no hope of rescue. Jake stood at the command center looking at the damage reports on his screen. The engine core had cracked during their jump through space, and now deadly radiation was leaking into the ship. His chief engineer, Ben Cooper, had already sealed off half the ship to keep his peace, but they were running out of clean air, and the life support systems would fail in less than 2 days. The New Horizon was an exploration ship that had been mapping new star systems for the past 5 years. They were supposed to return to Earth next month, but now they were stuck in empty space near a system called HFY. Jake had never heard of any intelligent life in this area, and their long-range scans showed nothing but a few small planets around a dying star. Dr. Lisa Hayes came to the bridge with her medical report. She was a tall woman with kind eyes who had been treating the crew members who got sick from the radiation. She told Jake that 12 people were already very ill and more would get sick soon if they could not fix the air cleaners. The radiation was making everyone weak and scared. Jake knew they had maybe 6 hours before people started dying. He had already sent out emergency signals on all frequencies, but no one had answered. Earth was too far away and there were no human ships in this part of space. He was thinking about recording final messages for the families back home when his communications officer got excited. Lieutenant Gary Bell was a young man who loved working with radios and computers. He called Jake over to his station and pointed at his screen. Someone was sending them a signal, but it was not in any human language. The message was repeating over and over in a pattern that seemed friendly, but Jake could not understand what it meant. Ben Cooper came up from the engine room covered in sweat and grease. He was a big man who could fix almost anything, but even he could not repair their broken engine without new parts. He looked at the alien message and shook his head. He said it might be someone offering help, but it could also be pirates or slavers who wanted to capture them. Jake made the hardest decision of his life. He told Gary to send a response using basic math and pictures to show that they were in trouble and needed help. Within an hour, a small ship appeared on their sensors. It was unlike any human ship, with smooth curves and a soft blue glow coming from its engines. The alien ship was called the Gentle Current, and its captain was named Zella Nim. She was from a species called the HFY, who looked like small fuzzy creatures with big eyes and gentle voices. When she spoke to Jake through the radio, her words were translated by her computer, and she sounded worried about the humans. Zella told Jake that her people were healers and builders who traveled through space helping others. She said her ship had medical supplies and tools that might be able to help fix the New Horizon. Jake was suspicious at first because he had been taught that most alien species were dangerous, but Zella sounded so sincere that he decided to trust her. The HFY ship docked with the New Horizon very carefully. Zella came aboard with 5 other HFY, including a doctor named Vextall and an engineer named Kemdar. They were small creatures about 4 feet tall with soft gray fur and large purple eyes that seemed to see everything. They moved quietly and spoke in whispers as if they were afraid of disturbing anyone. Dr. Vextall immediately went to the medical bay with Dr. Hayes to look at the sick crew members. The HFY doctor had strange tools that glowed with soft light, and when he used them on the humans, their pain went away and their skin stopped burning from the radiation. Dr. Hayes watched everything he did and asked many questions about how his medicine worked. Engineer Kemdar went with Ben Cooper to look at the broken engine. The HFY had never seen human technology before, but Kem was very smart and quickly understood how their systems worked. He brought special tools from his ship that could seal the crack in the engine core and stop the radiation leak. Captain Zella stayed on the bridge with Jake and looked at all the damage reports. She told him that fixing the New Horizon would take many days and her small crew would have to work very hard. Jake asked her why she wanted to help strangers, and Zella tilted her head like she did not understand the question. She said helping others was just what her people did, and she could not imagine leaving anyone to die in space over the next 3 weeks. The Kethver worked day and night to save the human ship. They shared their food when the human supplies ran low, and they taught the crew how to use Kethver medicine to stay healthy. Zella never asked for payment or anything in return. She just smiled with her big eyes and said she was happy to help friends. Dar. Hayes learned how to use Kethver healing tools, and she taught them about human biology. Ben Cooper showed Kem how human engines worked and learned about Kethver technology that used living crystals to power their ships. The two species worked together and became friends, even though they were very different. When the New Horizon was finally repaired and ready to fly again, Jake gathered all his crew and all the Kethver together in the main cargo bay. He stood before them and spoke words that would change the future of both species. He said that the human race owed the Kethver people a debt that could never be repaid, and that they would remember this kindness for as long as humans lived among the stars, the Kethver thought. Jake was just being polite, but they did not understand how humans really worked. They did not know that humans never forget those who help them when they are helpless, and that human gratitude can last for generations. They had just saved 847 human lives, and in doing so they had made humanity their protectors forever. 23 years had passed since the rescue of the New Horizon, and the galaxy had changed in ways that most species did not understand. The crew members who had been saved by the Kethver were now spread across human space, but each one carried the memory of alien kindness like a sacred flame that would never go out. Admiral Jake Morrison now commanded the 3rd Human Fleet from his flagship, the Defender. His hair was gray and his face had lines from years of command, but his eyes still held the same determination they had when he was a young captain dying in space. Every morning he looked at a small crystal sculpture that Zella Num had given him as a farewell gift, and he remembered his promise to never forget. Jake had used influence to make sure that human trade ships always stopped at Kethver worlds first when they were traveling through that part of space. Human companies were told that the Kethver were special friends and should get the best deals and the finest goods. Most business people thought it was just good politics, but Jake knew it was something much more important than money. Dr. Lisa Hayes had become the head of xenobiology at the Human Medical Institute on Earth. She had spent years studying Kethver healing methods and had written books about how their medicine could help humans live longer and healthier lives. She had also started an exchange program where young human doctors went to learn from Kethver healers, and Kethver students came to human worlds to study in their hospitals. Ben Cooper was now the chief engineer for the Colonial Development Corporation, and every ship he designed used a combination of human and Kethver technology. The engines he built were more efficient, and the life support systems were based on Kethver biological methods that could recycle air and water almost perfectly. Other species wanted to buy these new ships, but Ben made sure the Kethver always got them first and at cost. The Kethver homeworld of Nemthera had become the most important trading partner that humanity had outside of their own colonies. Human merchants brought them rare metals and advanced computers, while the Kethver shared their medical knowledge and their beautiful art. The small furry aliens had become rich and prosperous because of human friendship, and they were grateful. But they still did not understand the depth of human loyalty. Meanwhile, in another part of the galaxy, the Ktheran Empire was growing stronger and more aggressive with each passing year. The Kherans were tall reptilian creatures with sharp teeth and a culture based on conquest and domination. They had ruled the northwestern part of the galaxy for over 300 years, and they were always looking for new worlds to add to their empire. General Thakman was the leader of the Ktheran military, and he had been studying maps of the galaxy, looking for a weak species that his empire could easily conquer. The Kethver system had caught his attention because it was in a strategic location, and the Kethver were known to be peaceful creatures who had no real military. He thought they would be easy targets. The Ktherans began by sending trade missions to Kethver space, but these were really spies who were mapping their defenses and counting their ships. The Kethver welcomed the Ktherans with the same kindness they showed everyone, but they did not realize they were being studied like prey animals. by Hungry Predators. Ambassador Carol White was the human representative on Nemthera, and she had been living with the Kethver for 5 years. She was a smart woman who spoke their language fluently and understood their culture better than any other human. She had noticed the Theran ships coming and going, and something about them made her nervous. Carol had been on the new horizon as a young communications specialist when the Kethver saved them, and she had never forgotten how Zelanum had risked everything to help strangers. She considered the Kethver to be her second family, and she watched over them like a protective sister. When she saw Theran military advisors visiting Kethver colonies, she knew there was going to be trouble. The Therans started making demands. They said the Kethver needed protection from space pirates and offered to build military bases in their system. When the Kethver politely refused, the Therans said that maybe there should be new trade agreements that would give the Empire more control over Kethver shipping routes. Captain Zella Nim was now the leader of the Kethver Council, and she was much older, but still had the same kind heart that had saved the humans long ago. She tried to use diplomacy to deal with the Therans because her people did not believe in violence. She offered them friendship and trade, but she would not give them the control they wanted over her worlds. Carol sent reports back to Earth about what was happening, and her messages were read by people who understood their importance. President Helen Carter had been a junior officer on a human ship that had been saved by Kethver medics during a plague outbreak 15 years earlier. She knew that the aliens who had helped humanity so many times were now in danger. The Galactic Council held meetings about the situation, but most species were afraid to challenge the powerful Karen Empire. They passed resolutions and made speeches, but no one was willing to actually help the Kethver defend themselves. The council members thought it was just another case of a strong species bullying a weak one, and they did not want to get involved, but humans were different. When word spread through human space that the Kethver were being threatened, something began to happen that no other species expected. Ordinary humans who had never met a Kethver started demanding that their government take action. They had all heard the stories of how the furry aliens had saved human lives, and they felt a personal debt to repay. Commander Steve Parker was the grandson of a crew member who had been on the New Horizon, and he grew up hearing stories about Kethver kindness every night before bed. When he heard that they might be attacked, he volunteered to take his destroyer squadron to Kethver space, even though he had no official orders to do so. Amy Foster was the granddaughter of a human colonist who had been healed by Kethver doctors during a mining accident. She organized a hospital ship with volunteer doctors and nurses who wanted to help their alien friends if there was trouble. Her grandmother had told her that the Kethver never asked for anything in return for their help, and now it was time for humans to do the same. President Carter called an emergency meeting of the Human Colonial Assembly, and representatives came from all 12 human star systems. She stood before them and said words that would echo through history. She said that the Kethver had saved humanity when no one else would help them, and now it was time to save the Kethver in return. The vote was unanimous. Every human colony agreed to send ships to protect their alien friends. It was not about strategy, or politics, or gaining territory. It was about honor and gratitude, and the simple human belief that those who help you in your darkest hour deserve your protection when their own darkness comes. The Karens watched human ships moving toward Kethver space, and they were confused. Their intelligence reports said that humans had no strategic interest in that system and no valuable resources to protect. They could not understand why any species would risk war over creatures as weak and useless as the Kethver. General Thakman decided that the humans were bluffing and that they would back down when faced with superior Theran military power. He had never fought humans before, and he did not understand that they were driven by something more dangerous than strategy or greed. He did not know that human gratitude, once awakened, could shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. The message from the Theran Empire arrived at the Kethver Council chambers on a cold morning when the twin suns of Nemthera were hidden behind gray clouds. Ambassador Carol White sat beside Captain Zella Nem as they listened to the translated words that would change everything. General Thakman himself appeared on the communication screen with his cold reptilian eyes, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of centuries of conquest. The ultimatum was simple and brutal. The Kethver had 30 days to surrender their 3 outer colonies of Valandria, Casal, and Nem Minor to Theran control. They would also submit to having Theran military advisors oversee all their trade and defense decisions. If they refused, then the Empire would take what it wanted by force, and the Kethver people would face the consequences of defying a superior. Paua, Zella Nim listened to every word with the patience that her species was known for, but Carol could see the fear in her large purple eyes. The Kethver had never faced anything like this before because they had always solved problems through kindness and cooperation. They had no warships and no soldiers because violence was something their culture could barely understand. When the message ended, Zella turned to Carol and asked what the humans would do. She was not demanding help or expecting her friends to fight her battles, but she hoped that maybe humanity could use their influence in the Galactic Council to find a peaceful solution. Carol looked at her old friend and felt her heart break because she knew that diplomacy would not be enough this time. The Galactic Council called an emergency session when news of the Theran ultimatum spread through civilized space. Representatives from dozens of species gathered on the neutral station at Zarian Prime to discuss the crisis, but most of them were already afraid of what might happen if they opposed the Empire. The Therans had been the dominant military power in their region for so long that few species remembered what it was like to stand up to them. Ambassador Helen Torres represented humanity at the council, and she listened to hours of speeches and debates that said nothing meaningful. The Altarian delegates spoke about the importance of peaceful negotiations. The Centauri representative suggested economic sanctions that everyone knew would be ignored. The vegan counselor proposed sending a fact-finding mission that would take months to complete. Helen finally stood up and asked to address the council. She was a small woman with gray hair and a quiet voice, but when she spoke, everyone listened. Because humanity had become an important power in galactic affairs. She said that the council could debate and delay as much as they wanted, but the humans had already made their decision. The Kethver would be protected. The reaction was immediate and shocked. The Altarian delegate asked if humanity was seriously considering war with the Theran Empire over an insignificant species. The Centauri representative warned that such action could destabilize the entire galactic balance of power. The vegan counselor said that humans were being reckless and emotional instead of thinking rationally about galactic politics. Helen smiled sadly and told them that they were right about humans being emotional. She said that other species might make decisions based on logic and strategic advantage, but humans were different. They remembered who helped them when they were helpless, and they protected those friends no matter what the cost might be. Back in Kethver, Space Admiral Jake Morrison received his orders directly from Earth, and they were exactly what he had expected. President Carter had sent a simple message that said proceed to Kethver space with all available ships and protect their friends using any means necessary. The rules of engagement were clear, and Jake felt a familiar fire burning in his chest as he prepared his fleet for what might be their greatest battle. The third human fleet consisted of 42 ships, including cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. It was a powerful force, but Jake knew it would not be enough if the Therans brought their full military might to bear. The Empire had over 300 warships in their primary fleet, and they had been fighting wars for generations while humans were still relatively new to large-scale space combat. But something was happening across human space that no military analyst had predicted. When word spread that the Kethver were in danger and that human ships were moving to protect them, ordinary people began making extraordinary decisions. Ship captains changed course without orders. Civilian vessels armed themselves and headed for Kethver space. Even mining stations and research outposts began converting their equipment into weapons. Commander Steve Parker led the advanced squadron of 6 destroyers toward Nemthera, and his communications officer kept reporting new contacts joining their formation. First, it was a cargo hauler whose captain said his grandfather had been saved by Kethver doctors. Then came a civilian transport carrying volunteers who wanted to help their alien friends. Soon, Steve was leading a convoy of over 20 ships with more joining every hour. The Kethver watched in amazement as human vessels poured into their system. They had never seen so many ships in one place, and they could not understand why these people were risking their lives for aliens they had never met. Captain Zella Nim stood in her council chambers, looking up at the stars through the transparent dome, and she felt tears running down her furry cheeks. Dr. Amy Foster arrived aboard the hospital ship Mercy with a crew of volunteer doctors and nurses, who had dropped everything to come help. Her ship was painted with the medical symbols of both species, and she brought supplies that could treat both human and Kethver injuries. Amy had grown up hearing stories about how her grandmother was healed by alien medicine, and now she was ready to return that gift. The Ktheran fleet began massing at their forward base on Krex Prime, and intelligence reports said that General Thakman was assembling over 200 warships for the assault on Kethver space. The reptilian general was confident that he could sweep aside any human resistance and teach the galaxy what happened to species that interfered with Karen expansion, but Thakman was making the same mistake that many others had made when dealing with humans. He was thinking like a military strategist who calculated odds and measured resources. He did not understand that humans were driven by something that could not be quantified on any tactical display. He did not know about the debt of gratitude that an entire species carried in their hearts. Captain Roy Mitchell was commanding a civilian freighter 3 star systems away when he received word that the Kethver were under threat. His ship was not armed, and his crew consisted of only 12 people, but he immediately changed course for Nemthera. When his first officer asked why they were abandoning their cargo, Run Roy told him about a story his father had shared about aliens who saved human lives when no one else cared. Commander Ellen Price was on routine patrol duty near the Tau SETI system when emergency broadcasts reached her small squadron of 4 ships. She was supposed to continue her mission and wait for official orders, but when she heard that the Kethver needed help, she made a decision that would define her career. She told her captains they were going to war, and not one of them questioned the order. Similar scenes played out across human space as the word spread. Military officers abandoned their posts to join the growing fleet. Corporate executives ordered their security ships to Kethver space. Even scientists and explorers modified their vessels and headed toward the coming battle. The human government did not order this mobilization because it did not need to. The debt was calling and humanity was answering. Admiral Morrison watched his tactical display as more and more ships appeared on the edge of Kethver space. His official fleet of 42 vessels had grown to over 100, and the numbers kept climbing. Many of the ships were civilian craft with makeshift weapons, but they were crewed by people who understood what they were fighting for. The Galactic Council sent urgent messages demanding that humanity reconsider their actions. They warned about the consequences of starting a war with a major power. They talked about trade disruptions and diplomatic crises and the breakdown of civilized order. But their words fell on deaf ears because humans had already chosen their path. General Thakman received reports about the human buildup, and he dismissed most of them as exaggeration. His analysts told him that humans were rational creatures who would not sacrifice their ships and their people for such a minor ally. They calculated that the human fleet would withdraw when faced with superior firepower, and that the conquest of Kethver space would proceed as planned. The general was about to learn that there are some things that cannot be calculated or predicted. He was about to discover that human gratitude, once awakened, becomes something terrible and beautiful that can reshape the galaxy itself. The Kherans had chosen to threaten the wrong aliens, and now they would pay the price for underestimating the power of human memory. The Ktheran fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Valandria system like a storm front made of metal and death. 237 warships spread across space in perfect formation with General Thakman aboard his flagship, the Conqueror leading them toward what he thought would be an easy victory. The small Kethver colony below had no defenses and only a few 100,000 peaceful aliens who could not fight back. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship Defender and watched the enemy fleet approach through the darkness. His force had grown to 168 ships, but many of them were civilian vessels with improvised weapons and crews who had never seen real combat. Against the professional Theran military, it should have been no contest, but Jake had something that no computer could calculate. He had 847 people who remembered what it felt like to be helpless and alone until strangers risked everything to save them. The tactical display showed the overwhelming advantage that the Therans possessed, but Jake was not looking at numbers. He was thinking about Captain Zella Nim working day and night to repair his broken ship while asking for nothing in return. He was remembering Dr. Vextall healing his poisoned crew with gentle hands and alien medicine. He was seeing the faces of people who had shown humanity what real kindness looked like when they needed it most. General Thakman opened a communication channel to the human fleet, and his cold, reptilian voice echoed across space as he delivered his final ultimatum. He said that the humans had 1 hour to withdraw from Kethver space, or his fleet would destroy every ship that stood in his way. He reminded them that the Theran Empire had been conquering worlds when humanity was still learning to make fire, and that challenging his people was suicide. Jake Morrison activated his own communication system and responded with words that would be remembered for generations. He said that humans had learned many things since they started traveling between the stars, but the most important lesson was about loyalty. He told the general that the Kethver had saved human lives when they were strangers dying in space, and that debt would be repaid no matter what the cost. The hour passed in tense silence as both fleets prepared for battle. Human crews said prayers and checked their weapons while Theran warriors sharpened their claws and dreamed of victory. The Kethver colonists below huddled in their shelters, knowing that their fate would be decided by others, but grateful that they were not facing the darkness alone. At exactly the appointed time, General Thakman gave the order to attack, and the Theran fleet moved forward like a tide of destruction. Their ships were larger and more heavily armed than anything the humans possessed, and their tactics had been perfected through centuries of warfare. They should have swept the human defenders aside in minutes, but something happened that changed everything. As the first Theran missiles struck human ships and good people died defending aliens they had never met, a signal went out across human space that would echo through history. Every human colony, every space station, every ship that could move suddenly knew that their friends were under attack and that their protectors were dying. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Captain Roy Mitchell had been traveling toward Kethver space in his unarmed freighter when the battle began. His ship had no weapons and his crew was not trained for combat, but when he saw human vessels being destroyed, he made a decision that cost him his life and saved countless others. He aimed his ship at the nearest Karen cruiser and rammed it at full speed, knowing that his sacrifice would cripple an enemy vessel, the sight of a civilian cargo ship deliberately destroying itself to protect the Kethver sent shockwaves through both fleets. Human crews who had been scared began fighting with desperate fury, while Theran commanders who thought they understood warfare realized they were facing something beyond their experience. These humans were not fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for honor, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. Commander Ellen Price led her 4-ship squadron in a direct assault on the Theran battle line, and her vessels were outnumbered 10-1. Her ships were smaller and weaker, but her crews fought like demons because they knew what they were protecting. When her flagship was crippled, she transferred to another vessel and kept fighting. When that ship was destroyed, she took command of a damaged freighter and continued the attack. Meanwhile, across human space, the greatest mobilization in their history was taking place. Ships that had been years away from Kethver space began making impossible journeys at speeds that burned out their engines. Military vessels abandoned their posts without orders. Corporate fleets converted their cargo haulers into warships. Even deep space research stations emptied their docks and sent every ship they had toward the battle. Dr. Amy Foster worked frantically aboard her hospital ship as wounded humans and Kethver were brought to her for treatment. She had Theran weapons, fire burning through her hull and enemy fighters trying to destroy her medical vessel, but she never stopped healing those who had been hurt defending her grandmother's saviors. Her nurses worked through explosions and her doctors operated while the ship shook from nearby impacts. The battle that was supposed to last 1 hour stretched into 6, as more human ships kept arriving to replace those that had been destroyed. General Thakman watched his tactical display in growing confusion as his advantage disappeared under waves of human reinforcements that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His fleet was designed to fight other organized militaries, but this was something completely different. Every time a Theran ship destroyed a human vessel, 2 more would appear to take its place. Cargo haulers with welded-on weapons rammed carrion cruisers. Mining ships used their industrial lasers to cut through enemy armor. Research vessels converted their sensor arrays into guided missiles. The humans were improvising and sacrificing and dying, but they kept coming because the debt demanded payment. Admiral Morrison coordinated the chaotic battle from his flagship, while tears ran down his face as he watched good people die for aliens most of them had never met. But he also felt pride burning in his chest because he was seeing humanity at its finest. These were not professional soldiers following orders. These were ordinary people who understood that some things were more important than their own lives. The turning point came when the Theran flagship Conqueror found itself surrounded by 30 human vessels that had somehow punched through the enemy formation. General Thakman realized too late that he had underestimated not just human military capability, but human nature itself. These creatures fought with an intensity that his own warriors could not match because they were driven by something his cold reptilian mind could not comprehend. Sergeant Don Collins led the boarding party that captured the Conqueror after his assault ship rammed through its armored hull. His great-aunt had been saved by Kethfer healers on the original New Horizon, and he had grown up knowing that his family owed their existence to alien kindness. When he faced General Thakman in hand-to-hand combat, he was not just fighting for military victory. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been helped by strangers. When they had nowhere else to turn, the battle ended with the Theran fleet scattered and broken while human ships filled the space around Valandria like protective angels. Over 300 human vessels had been destroyed and 15,000 people had died, but the Kethver colonies were safe. The price had been terrible, but it had been paid willingly by those who understood that true friendship is worth any sacrifice. General Thakman sat in his prison cell aboard a human ship and tried to understand what had happened to his invincible fleet. His analysts had calculated odds and measured firepower, but they had never factored in the power of gratitude transformed into fury. The Therans had chosen to threaten the wrong species, and now their empire would face the consequences of that choice. News of the victory spread across the galaxy, and other species watched in amazement as humanity mourned their dead while celebrating the survival of their alien friends. The Galactic Council called for investigations, and the major powers demanded explanations, but humans ignored them all. They were too busy honoring the fallen heroes who had proven that some debts can only be paid in blood and that human memory burns eternal among the stars. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 3 days after the Battle of Valandria, and the Great Chamber on Zarian Prime had never seen such tension. Representatives from every major species sat in their assigned places while the holographic displays showed the wreckage of the once mighty Karen fleet floating in space around the saved Kethver colonies. The impossible had happened, and no one knew what it meant for the future of galactic civilization. Ambassador Helen Torres stood at the central podium, wearing the black uniform of mourning that humans wore to honor their fallen warriors. Her face was tired and her voice was heavy with grief, but her eyes burned with the same determination that had driven her species to sacrifice so much for alien friends. Around her, the council members whispered and argued about the consequences of humanity's actions, but she waited patiently for them to quiet down. The Altarian delegate was the first to speak, and his blue-scaled face showed the confusion that most species felt about what they had witnessed. He asked how humanity could justify starting a war that had killed thousands of people and destroyed hundreds of ships over what he called a minor territorial dispute. He said that the Therans had only wanted to expand their influence and that diplomatic solutions could have been found if humans had been patient. The Centauri representative agreed and added that humanity's emotional response had destabilized the entire northwestern sector of the galaxy. She pointed out that trade routes were now unsafe and that other aggressive species might be encouraged to start their own wars if they thought the galactic balance of power had shifted. She demanded that humans pay reparations for the damage they had caused to galactic peace. Helen listened to every accusation and complaint without interrupting because she knew that most species would never understand what drove her people to fight and die for others. When the chamber finally fell silent, she began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of 15,000 graves and the love of an entire species for their alien friends. She told them about the new horizon, dying in space with 847 people facing certain death until strangers risked everything to save them. She described how the Kethver had worked for weeks without payment or reward simply because helping others was who they were. She explained that humans measured friendship not in trade agreements or strategic alliances, but in the willingness to sacrifice for those who had sacrificed for them. The vegan counselor interrupted to say that one act of kindness decades ago could not justify such a massive military response. He argued that humans were being irrational and that mature species learned to move beyond emotional attachments when making important decisions. He suggested that humanity needed better leaders who could think more clearly about galactic politics. Helen smiled sadly and told him that he was absolutely right about humans being irrational. She said that other species might calculate the value of friendship in terms of profit and loss, but humans saw it differently. When someone saved your life when you were helpless, they became family, and you protected family no matter what the cost might be. She activated a holographic display that showed the faces of every human who had died at Villandria, and she read their names one by one. Captain Roy Mitchell, who had rammed his freighter into a Theran cruiser. Commander Ellen Price, who had fought 3 different enemy ships before finally being overwhelmed. Dr. Amy Foster, who had died treating wounded while her hospital ship was under fire. Each name carried the story of someone who had chosen to die, rather than abandon their alien friends. The chamber grew quiet as Helen continued reading, and the council members began to understand that they were not just hearing casualty reports. These were the names of people who had volunteered to face death because they believed that some debts could only be repaid with blood. Most species had forgotten what that kind of loyalty looked like, but humanity had just shown the galaxy its true power when she finished reading the names. Helen told the council that every human world was building memorials to honor the fallen heroes of Villandria. She said that children would grow up learning their stories and understanding that the greatest honor any person could achieve was to die protecting those who had protected them. The sacrifice would be remembered forever, and it would inspire future generations to show the same courage. The Theran representative finally spoke from his place at the back of the chamber. General Thakman had been replaced after his defeat, and the new leader was a smaller reptilian creature who seemed nervous about facing the human ambassador. He said that his people wanted peace and that they were willing to discuss reparations for the damage caused by their failed invasion. Helen turned to look at him, and her expression softened slightly because she could see that he was genuinely afraid of what humanity might do next. She told him that humans did not want revenge or reparations from the Theran Empire. They only wanted assurance that the Kethver would never be threatened again, and that other species would understand the consequences of attacking humanity's friends. The discussion that followed lasted for hours as council members tried to understand the new reality that humanity had created. The human species had just proven that they would sacrifice anything to protect those who had helped them, and that knowledge would reshape every diplomatic calculation in the galaxy. Some species would seek human friendship while others would be very careful not to threaten human allies. President Helen Carter addressed the Human Colonial Assembly from Earth 3 weeks later, and her speech was broadcast to every human world and settlement. She stood before the representatives who had voted unanimously to protect the Kethver, and she told them that their decision had changed the course of galactic history. The sacrifice of 15,000 heroes had sent a message that would echo through the stars for generations. She announced the creation of the New Horizon, doctrine which would become official human policy for dealing with alien species. Any civilization that helped humanity in times of crisis would become humanity's responsibility to protect. The galaxy would learn that making friends with humans was valuable, but threatening human friends was the most dangerous mistake any species could make. The Kethver held their own ceremonies to honor the humans who had died protecting them, and Captain Zella Nim spoke words that would be carved in crystal monuments on every Kethver world. She said that her people had thought they were simply helping strangers in need, but they had accidentally created the most powerful alliance in galactic history. Human gratitude had become their shield, and human friendship had become their strength. The memorial gardens planted on human worlds grew into beautiful parks, where people came to remember the heroes of Valandria and to teach their children about the true meaning of loyalty. The names of every Kethver who had participated in the original rescue were also carved in stone because humans understood that heroism came in many forms and that small acts of kindness could have consequences that lasted forever. Other species began to take notice of how humans treated their allies, and many sought to establish closer relationships with the unpredictable creatures who fought like demons for their friends. Trade agreements were signed and cultural exchanges were established, but everyone understood that real friendship with humanity required more than contracts and negotiations. The Karen Empire never recovered from their defeat at Valandria, and they quietly withdrew from the northwestern sector of the galaxy. Other aggressive species looked at the wreckage of the once mighty Karen fleet and decided that perhaps conquest was not as easy as they had thought. The balance of power had shifted, and humanity sat at the center of a new alliance based not on fear or greed, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. Years passed, and the galaxy settled into a new peace that was more stable than anything that had come before. Species that had helped humans found themselves protected by the most loyal friends they had ever known, while those who threatened human allies discovered that some mistakes could destroy entire empires. The lesson had been written in fire and blood across the stars, and it would never be forgotten. The story of the New Horizon and the debt that followed became legend, but it was a legend based on truth. Humans really did remember those who helped them, and their gratitude really could shatter worlds when it was threatened. The Kethver had saved 847 strangers, and in return they had gained the eternal protection of an entire species who understood that some gifts can only be repaid with everything you have done in the end. The galaxy learned that humanity was different from other species in ways that could not be measured or predicted. They formed bonds that transcended politics, and they kept promises that other civilizations would have forgotten. Their friendship was valuable beyond calculation, but their enmity was something that wise species avoided at all costs because human memory burned eternal among the stars, and human gratitude, once awakened, could indeed shatter worlds.